For his father had been a leper, and when he was a little boy, they had stoned his father to death. Have you ever encountered a group of lepers? I remember the first time I did. And we were visiting a place of ministry, and the missionary that started the ministry there had a canopy over this huge piece of ground, and there were about 30 lepers lined up in various stages of their leprosy, some of them without their fingers, some without even their whole hands, their feet crippled, some with a peg leg on a crutch. And they were lined up, and two of our missionaries were sitting cross-legged on the ground, and they would come and sit there with them, and they would clean their wounds, and then they would re-bandage them. Such compassion I just never seen. And then after they left that line, they formed another line where they received their meal for the day. And so they would carry a bucket, and in the bucket they would have soup or whatever, liquid on the bottom part, and then the top platform they would heap it full of rice. And that was the only meal that many of them had, and some of them couldn't even feed themselves. So some of our missionaries would go back with them and help feed them every day. I never really witnessed such depth of compassion and love. Well, how did this ministry start? Well, it started with one of our missionaries who went to this area, a very large village, and for a year he prayed and fasted and visited and tried to share the gospel, and he was rejected. He was beaten times. No one would pay any attention to him except the lepers. And so he would start with visiting with lepers, sharing about God's love and helping them in real ways. And over time, people saw this love and this compassion, and it opened up doors. And pretty soon a church was established there in the ministry to the lepers. And in this area, there were maybe 30 or 40 areas of leper colonies where, because the 2 or 3 small hospitals wouldn't even treat the lepers, wouldn't even take them in. And so even though it was a curable disease, because of superstition and these type of lack of information, leprosy had spread into many areas. And so at this time in my first visit, they had started churches in about 12 of these areas and had 25 places that they were ministering to the lepers. And so this was the man that I met. And to see his heart, his love, his compassion. His story is so typical of many of our missionaries who go to a place and endure hardship and humbly seek the Lord to have the Lord open the doors. And then we see church and churches established and ministry flourishing because they're willing to pay that price. Well, I remember the second time I went to this place. The pastor or missionary had shared with me a vision that they would have a clinic or some place that they could treat the lepers. There was about an acre in the middle of this very large village, which village had grown up around it. And that's where the ministry had taken place, where they had the canopy for the Bridge of Hope students and for the leper ministry. And the story was that the man who owned this ground was coming back after 40 years and was going to sell the ground. The church knew that their offer would not be the highest. This very desirable ground, and so many very wealthy people wanted to own this ground. So the church prayed and fasted for 2 weeks that the Lord would open a door for them to receive this ground. So the day came when the offers were to be made, and they were one of the last ones to make an offer, and they came and shared what they could afford to acquire this ground. And the man said, well, what are you going to do with this ground? And they said, well, we minister to the lepers and to the children. And the man began to sob uncontrollably. For his father had been a leper, and when he was a little boy, they had stoned his father to death, and his mother died shortly thereafter. And he went to the U.S., where he eventually became a doctor. And he was now returning to his ancestral home to sell this property. And so he sold the property to our missionaries, to the church, to start a clinic. Remarkable. They were so full of joy at seeing the Lord move. I still get broken up. Well, then on my next visit, I saw that they had started constructing the clinic, a 4-bedroom clinic, simple clinic, and they were doing it themselves. And so they were giving me a progress report. But one thing that was happening was there was a man in this little room about 10 by 10. And this man was squatting on the floor, sitting on the floor, and he was working with leather and utensils. And what he was doing is he was making shoes for the lepers because they needed to be custom made. And he would have a paper pattern drawn by someone, and he would then use that pattern to make the shoes, which were immensely valuable to these lepers because they couldn't feel pain, they couldn't feel things, so they were protected by these leather shoes. And he just sat there every day. The Lord had called him to do this, to use his skills. And so that's what he was doing. Well, on my next visit, they had the building completed. They showed me the building, and they were so excited at what the Lord had provided. And so they were still praying. They were praying that there would be a doctor who could come and full-time, because not only did they minister to the lepers there, that leper colony, but there were 35 other colonies within 20, 25 miles that they ministered to. And so that was their prayer. And so in faith, continuing to believe, the church had grown tremendously, and God was just using their lives. There were now 40 other churches that were all in that surrounding area. What a thrill to see God's work moving forward. Well, my last visit to get there, they had a full-time doctor. Praise the Lord. And not only was that man still making shoes, it expanded that he was making shoes for lepers all over the country. And they would have, in the mail would come the patterns, the paper patterns, and there were 2 other men working with him full-time to make shoes for these lepers. There were still long lines of feeding, long lines of cleaning their wounds and bandaging them. My wife and I, on a couple of the trips, we got to actually stand in line and feed the people. Used to American sizes of things, I dished out some rice, and the leaders came and said, "You need to give them more." And so we did. So what a thrill. Recently, we just had a report that 12 areas where they had leper colonies, that they've eradicated the leprosy in those areas, that they no longer needed to schedule treatments. In that report that we received, we also learned that there are 40 or 50 other leper colonies that have been identified that need ministry, such as the ones that we've already worked in. And so we now have over 200 Sisters of Compassion who have been trained specifically to be able to work with the lepers, to clean their wounds, to bandage them, to go to their homes and assist in their feeding and health care and things like that, and also to encourage them, to be a friend. You know, some of these lepers never have had anyone put their arm around them or touch them until our Sisters of Compassion and our missionaries have come along and have touched them and treated them with the dignity that the Lord treats all of us with. And so this ministry, which God has blessed tremendously, started with one missionary going to an area, facing many obstacles and challenges to share the gospel, to plant a church. And from those humble beginnings, the Lord has not only built many churches, He's also helped us start a ministry to lepers that we never thought of. The very first leper ministry started in that village. And it's a testimony to God's faithfulness to our brothers and sisters as they pour out their lives to be used of the Lord in a mighty way. So praise the Lord, and that's the goal, is to not only spread the gospel, but to eradicate this disease with education and treatment and things that were not available before. This one missionary came, obeyed God. Look what he did.